Hi, everyone. Welcome today to our webinar. My name is Eve Howe. I'm the Manager of Policy Development here at TransLink. For those of you joining us from outside of this region, TransLink is Metro Vancouver's integrated multimodal transportation authority. We also provide transit services. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, on whose territory we work, operate, and serve. So the purpose of this webinar today is to examine the remote work trend and its impact on transportation. So we'll be recording this and we'll be publishing it online. And you'll have the opportunity to ask questions using Slido as part of our Q&A. And I'll get to that in a bit more in a few more minutes. So I'm going to first start by advancing the screen. There we go. So since the global pandemic began, in order to keep people socially distanced, we saw remote work at levels that we had never anticipated. There was a massive uptake, and it also had a significant effect on transportation overnight. These are some of the headlines that we saw in this country. And so right now, we're starting to wonder, what does this mean for the future? Are we going to see remote work as something that sticks around post-pandemic? And if so, what might the impacts, both good and bad, be on transportation and other aspects of our society and economy? So to help us answer that question, I'm joined by a great panel of experts today from sectors around North America. We'll be hearing from Patricia Monktarian, who is a professor from Georgia Tech, and she's been researching transportation behavior and remote work for years. We are joined by Javi Parker-Sutton, who's Director of Sales for TELUS, which is one of Canada's leading leaders in promoting digital access. And as well, Leah Riley, who is Managing Director at Nelson Nygaard, a leading international transportation planning firm. So before we go into the panel and the Q&A, I'm going to give a bit of local context and flavor from what we've seen in this region of the impact of remote work. So in this province, before COVID, estimates were that about 18% of employees partially teleworked. And this is about a day a week or a day every 2 weeks. 7% fully teleworked. But during the COVID peak, we estimated in this region that this number increased by threefold. And we have further estimates that about half of the jobs in this region could be potentially able to be conducted remotely. So what were some of those impacts that we saw during that threefold COVID, threefold increase in remote work during the peak of the pandemic lockdown? So in terms of transit ridership, we certainly saw impacts, but it's very hard to disentangle the impacts of remote work. It's hard to disentangle it from all the other impacts that the pandemic brought, concerns about safety, unemployment rates. Our estimates are rough, but we estimate that about 5 to 15% of our ridership loss was due to remote work and remote learning during the pandemic. What we're finding is that the impact is not equally distributed. Certainly the routes that serve universities, we've noticed that although we've suspended or substantially reduced service on those routes, we're not seeing levels of crowding like we had prior in spite of reduced service. As well, if you look at our West Coast Express, which is our commuter train service that runs in the morning into the downtown core and in the evening back out to the suburbs, that has experienced some of the most significant drops across our network. It is down to 17% of pre-COVID levels, whereas system-wide we're closer to 40%. So we can speculate that downtown office closures might be part of the reason for that. We've also seen some shifts in ridership in terms of the peaks. So office workers have very regular hours. They tend to be 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 around that area. So they tend to travel at similar times. They're causing a morning peak and an afternoon peak. And during the pandemic, one of the things we've noticed is that that peak has been smoothening over and potentially as a result of reduced commute by office workers. So beyond transit impacts, there's other transportation impacts that we saw. I think certainly in earlier parts of the spring, with lockdown, we saw a significant decrease in congestion because of people staying at home and working from home. This has started to return over time as people are returning to the office. And as the associated emissions would have dropped during that period as well. In terms of longer term impacts of remote work, we have a lot of questions, not a lot of answers yet. But will a continuation of remote work result in people reconsidering vehicle ownership? With less commuting, will families look to shed maybe their second or third vehicle? Will loss of that commute pattern result in different travel patterns? And again, this is a question we don't know yet. If you no longer need to make that commute to work, will you start staying local for your groceries or your daily needs? And if you're staying closer to home, will you be more willing to walk or bike to those? As well, non-transportation impacts, again, more questions than answers. What will the impact of remote work be on the commercial real estate sector or for small businesses that support office workers and students? This is a picture of Vancouver during the pandemic, and you can see that certainly the downtown core is a lot more quiet than it normally would be during weekday daytimes. Will there be a change in demand for larger homes? If people are working from homes, does the need for a home office or two home offices suddenly drive demand for larger homes? What's the health impact of sitting at home all day? Is that good for our health? Or does reducing the commute reduce stress for people who are already stretched and busy families? Will that result in positive health benefits, as well as reduce exposure to emissions and pollution from your commute? These are some of the questions we have. And these are some of the questions that we'll be exploring as part of Transport 2050. Transport 2050 is the region's long-range transportation plan. We expect remote work. It's currently under development, and we expect remote work to feature in this plan as something we're exploring. And in it, we'll be looking at we'll be exploring what the strategies and actions are to support remote work. Are there actions in terms of technology, policy regulations, tax credits, and education? So a lot of questions, and I'm going to pass along in a minute the mic to our first speaker. But before that, I'm going to put up the slide. So we'll be taking questions throughout the presentations. So if you want to log into www.slido.com, either on your handheld device or on your browser, and put in the code #remote work, feel free to enter your questions as they come to your mind as you're hearing the presentations, and then we will address them all at the end. Also, feel free, if you don't have a question, to have a look at the questions other people are asking and vote them up. And we'll be taking the questions from those that are the most popular and that most people have on their minds. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Patricia Monktarian.
Thank you, Eve. I'm waiting for, control of the screen. Here we are. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this really interesting and important conversation. Believe me, it's going on in a lot of places, certainly south of the border as well. I took the title for this short overview from the description of this session that Kian had circulated. And I have to say that the answer is, of course, uncertain, but I would suggest that there are reasons to be skeptical that teleworking will continue, certainly not at the same level as we've been seeing. Why do I say that? Well, again, I've been looking at this for quite a long time and have seen lots of hype about working from home over the years. As far back as 1980, Alvin Toffler was talking about the electronic cottage where we'd all live and work and happily ever after. Peter Drucker in 1993 was saying that commuting is obsolete. We just need to move information instead of people. And then we had Francis Cairncross declaring the death of distance in the mid-90s. And in between then and now, we've had countless extreme events, all of which promoted telework during the duration of the event, especially when you didn't have much other choice but to work from home or not at all because of the transportation system being affected, or a building or more buildings being affected, of course, the pandemic, weather events, and so on. So this is just a partial list. These are ones for which I either already had in my files or could readily find media coverage of teleworking during these kinds of events. And if you look at a headline from a quarter century ago, and this one has to do with the 1994 Northridge, Los Angeles earthquake. If you replace the word earthquake with pandemic, you get headlines that sound really familiar, as if they were drawn from yesterday's news. Pandemic, telecommuting takes off after pandemic. Building owners are converting unused spaces to accommodate workers under new conditions. Most employees welcome the change. So you have to maybe excuse me for being a little bit cynical that I've seen a lot of this before. And of course, what's happened in previous extreme events is that we all telecommuted when we had to, but when we didn't have to, most of us went back to the way things were before. Well, but you say technology is much better now than it was in 1980, and that's for sure. But I would also suggest that technology has never been the main barrier to the adoption of teleworking, and many others who've looked at this a long time agree. And in fact, we've seen some pretty high-tech companies such as Yahoo, Reddit, IBM, and others embrace teleworking for a while and then eventually either cut it back or withdraw it altogether. So you may say, but okay, now that we've had to do it and on a prolonged basis, management is much more receptive. And by the way, employees love it and want to keep doing it. And maybe, but I wonder myself how solid these expressed preferences are. Certainly, we've seen some anecdotal signs of softening. If you even just look at the fine print headlines of these websites, working from home, silver lining or double-edged sword, companies start to think remote work isn't so great after all. Can remote work be fixed? And this last one is actually a headline that Eve had already shown relating to it's not all it's cracked up to be. And this one's by a white-collar millennial, self-described. So I found that one particularly interesting. And then there's been a lot of research looking at the parameters, if you will, of teleworking adoption and engagement, both before COVID and during COVID. And we're seeing a fairly stable pattern, if you will, perhaps surprisingly stable with respect to things like frequency. A number of studies found an average frequency of teleworking among those who telework of about 1.5 days a week. And there was a Gallup poll in October, this October 2020, saying that teleworking during the pandemic was averaging about 1.45 days per week. When you look at pre-COVID statistics on amounts of teleworking, one of the things you always want to do is look at what definition is being used. And when you realize that, again, for people who work from home, it's usually only a few hours a day, much less than full day, you start to wonder, oh, maybe that's checking email at home in evenings and on weekends rather than a full day replacing the commute to the main office. And then a number of pre-COVID studies suggested that teleworking was not permanent for probably up to half the people who started it, and that they had stopped doing so within a few months, or in some cases as much as a few years. So all of that evidence, again, both before and during the pandemic, suggests to me that there are optimum desired levels of teleworking for most people that may be lower than perhaps is being touted as a general rule. Of course, it'll be a distribution. A lot of people are perfectly happy doing it full time, but a lot of people aren't, and the question is, where will we land? So in my perception, the key reasons that teleworking has been slow to be adopted in the past haven't really gone away. You'll hear workers and employers alike talk about the importance of being together, of serendipity, of tacit knowledge transmission, the need to have people in person when onboarding new employees and mentoring young career professionals. You see employee preferences that they may say, yeah, I want to work at home a lot, but what does that mean? And what does it boil down to when they have the opportunity actually to do so? You see people for whom home is simply not a conducive place to work, or who don't have the self-discipline to work well at home. And so all of those things are, again, I believe, fairly stable in the population. So my guess is that we'll have a substantial return to pre-COVID conditions. Obviously, there will be new adopters that keep at it afterwards. And the question always is, how many, right? I think it's safe to say that we're not going to snap all the way back to where we were before. I'd be the first to agree with that. But neither would I say that, oh, it's all different now and suddenly we've all seen the light and we're going to keep doing it happily ever after. We're going to be somewhere in between. And I know you're all saying, well, duh, I could have told you that. So I'm going to go out on a limb and have a probabilistic prediction here that says if you look at the horizontal axis as representing where we were before the pandemic at the lower end and where we were at the height of the pandemic at the upper end, we're going to be somewhere in between there after the pandemic. And so the vertical axis is the probability that we'll be at any one of these places. And as you can see, I'm putting the bulk of my probability prediction, if you will, toward the lower end of that range. But the nice thing is that everybody can be right. So it turns out, that if you look at framing it a certain way, then it looks great. And if you frame the same data a different way, it may not look so great. In the U.S., we have, from the U.S. Census data, about 5% of the workforce usually working from home before the pandemic, and 50% as a reasonable average doing so during the pandemic. So if we bounce back to 10% after the pandemic, the skeptic can say, I told you, we've lost 90% of those who began working from home during the pandemic. And the optimist can say, wow, we've doubled the share of employees who work from home. And similarly, we can say, the number of employees teleworking has doubled, but the work from home frequency hasn't changed if we remain at that 1.5 days per week average. So depending on which statistic you look at, how you're measuring adoption, how you're measuring engagement, you can probably find something to support what you expected. So that's good. But, again, we need to know what will happen to transportation, to residential location, and those kinds of things that you've mentioned. Others have been quick to point out that even if we have a relatively small amount of teleworking remaining after we don't have to anymore, that can still have a noticeable impact on peak period traffic. And that's true, but again, history has suggested that once you release capacity or enhance capacity on a transportation link, then other kind of compensating effects kick in. People shift from off-peak to peak, so they don't have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning anymore. They change modes from transit to auto, because now auto is, in fact, faster and less stressful. They change routes from a longer, more tedious surface street to a highway, now that there's more capacity on the highway. And they may even generate newer, longer trips, again, move farther away from work or whatever the case may be. So I'm not expecting teleworking to reduce congestion noticeably any more than it has in the last few decades that we've been promoting it for doing so. However, it is worth pointing out that even if the new release capacity fills up again, we still have more travelers better off than before, at least at an individual level. You can debate what happens at a societal level as you have more and more traffic accommodated. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, at least for now, but I look forward to having the conversation with all of us in a moment.
Thank you, Pat. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Javi Parker-Sutton, who is Director of Sales from TELUS, one of Canada's leading leaders in promoting digital access. Javi, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Let's see if I can make the Okay, well, I think I probably have a slightly different perspective than Pat in terms of remote work. So the perspective that I'm going to talk about today is really around the future and what do we see as game-changing technology. So what we've noticed is during COVID, of course, there's been an accelerating factor for remote work. What might have happened in 5 or 6 years, and as Pat mentioned, we've been talking about it since the 90s, has actually happened over months. In Canada, the percentage of people that were working remotely before the pandemic was 3.6%, and about 40% in wave one. So, is remote work here to stay? I don't know, but I think a lot of things have actually changed, and people were forced, and businesses were forced to look at things differently and really to adapt very quickly. One of the main focus areas is how does technology be a game changer in helping with that? And something that is important for us to also recognize is despite the remarkable increase that we had on usage at the beginning of the pandemic, Canada's networks, all the way from urban all the way to rural, really remained consistently robust, which meant that our economy and our productivity was able to stay very functional against the world economy, which is pretty impressive. So, I think you have to look at some of the access foundations that we've got, and 5G is going to be a game changer for that. So when we look at what are the tools and what's going to be envisionable by 2050, we're looking at things like augmented reality, virtual reality. There's certain job functions and industries that are much more likely to be able to work remotely and to use some of those tools. For example, engineering, design, computing sciences. But even the ones that are more likely less easy to be remote workers, such as construction and manufacturing, even those ones, the technology and the tools to be able to do that are getting better and better, and we already have a lot of those things in place. We have the ability to, in our health authority, what they're saying now is virtual first. And will they go back to completely having all of the patients in clinics and in the hospital? Likely not, because of the efficiency and the time savings for those patients, the safety of the clinicians, etc. So when you think about remote work, and it really is about removing the boundaries that we have today. So it's no longer about a set place to work. It's giving employees that flexibility. And what that might mean is you might want to work or live close to your family and friends, or to that ski hill, or to the cottage. So it's not that unlikely that you could be 100+ kilometers away from your main office and still be able to carry on your work. And of course, we have to consider high-speed, green, cheap, autonomous transformation that could allow us to get to downtown quickly when we're thinking about being farther and farther out. And this is where we start to look at how do we link remote work to technology, and how does transportation deliver that? Pat mentioned that there's barriers to technology, and there's 3 main barriers that we see, and that is technology, economics, and cultural transformation. So I'll talk a little bit about each of those 3. So in terms of technology, one of the big barriers is high-speed connectivity. In Canada, there's 14% of rural Canadians that don't have access to high-speed connectivity. TELUS actually, in February of 2020 in BC, has connected greater than communities that have greater than 1,000 individuals. They all have now got 4G LTE networks, which is pretty impressive. But there's lots of still smaller communities that we still need to get to. So high-speed connectivity is definitely a barrier for some. Another barrier is cybersecurity. So the adoption of remote worker tools has significantly increased. And employees are now accessing sensitive information from applications in the cloud and often downloading them to consumer-grade internet networks. Companies need to ensure the data stored in the cloud or on employee devices is fully secure and only accessible from authenticated users. And the last area that I'll mention about technology is around IT support. Employees face challenges troubleshooting problems at home. And, do they call their home service provider? Do they call their business support team? The IT teams also have challenges as they assist employees to adopt the new tools and the applications. In terms of the economics, there is the cost of the technology. So as many businesses are adopting to services to enable the remote work, such as unified collaboration tools, security, connectivity, they also continue to have to support the existing office-based structure. So it could be that the technology costs actually increase. There's also the consideration of real estate. So many of these businesses have downtown properties, and so they need to continue to maintain those, and they have long-term leases. So it's not necessarily just a quick jump to everybody work remotely. And what's the balance, and what does that look like? Another cost from an economic perspective to consider is the people and the training. Transformation, business operations. You need to enable leaders to think in a different way and to lead in a different way when you're working remotely. So the cultural transformation actually becomes one of the largest barriers. The whole change, the resistance to change, the way that people are managed and led is really a very big part of that. So at TELUS, we've actually been looking at this for over 10 years, and our program is called Work Styles. So the reason that we started with Work Styles was in 2007, we had employee engagement scores that were about 53%, and we really needed to look at how do we become a world-class culture and how do we embrace flexibility into that world-class culture. So there was 4 key ways that we measure success with this, and we've had lots of lessons learned along the way. One of the key ones was team members. So our engagement scores went from 53% up to 84% in 2019, and I actually believe they're higher. I think it's 87% company-wide in 2020. So the satisfaction about having the flexibility really made a huge difference. The other area was operations. And so from an operations perspective, it's about that business continuity. So Pat also mentioned, you can take pandemic and you can replace it with the fires, and you can replace it with Calgary floods, and you can replace it with the Olympics. And all of those things say, as an employee, I can continue to function from anywhere, anytime. And that's been very substantive in terms of our operations and our ability to continue to stay productive. During COVID, 75% of our employees pre-COVID were already mobile or working at home. And after COVID, we were actually able to take even the contact centers that we have internationally and make all of those basically mobile within a week. So it was just amazing how quickly we were able to actually make that transformation. From a real estate perspective, we've reduced our floor space since 2006 by 50%, which was a substantive part of that whole business case. And the travel costs for the individual employees reduced by $40 million. So, the gas, the commute, all of those things. Also, when you look at it from an environmental perspective, we actually measure our environment through a sustainability report. And the savings on carbon gases, on time, and on commuting are very substantial. So how do we make the most of remote work, and how do we kind of make sure that we continue this? We need to see broadband and cloud computing as a cornerstone to enable this remote work, which will impact people's housing needs, their transportation needs. So if we assume a significant proportion of our remote workers will continue to stay remotely, how does that change the landscape, and what do we need to look at? Recently, there was a UBS, a rapid response stream of $150 million for projects to be completed from November 15th, 2021. This is a welcome announcement. The government of BC has announced in September an injection of $90 million into a Connecting BC program to encourage rapid expansion of high-speed internet access. And over the last years, we've seen both public and private investments made into infrastructure. And the objective is to cover all of the regions of Canada. So there's three considerations that I think that we would want to explore. One is around embedding technology into that urban planning. And so the types of things that we would do is build a foundation for smart cities, manage that physical distancing, attracting and retaining citizens to build a competitive advantage versus other cities, enhance planning, management, and secure public infrastructure. The next is around reflecting in the transportation planning. So remote work has implications on the volume and frequency of public transport needs. While it's decreased usage for several industries more suited for remote work, such as finance, professional services, those industries are actually 80+% able to adapt remotely. There are other certain job functions that it's less suited for, such as essential services and construction. And so we need to take that into consideration when we're looking at the planning. So link public transportation planning based on industry-specific areas. And thirdly, rejuvenate local communities. So more people staying or moving back to their local communities means the need to accommodate health services, daycare, professional services, transportation needs, and construction. So factor in urban decentralization and the impact on public services versus population density and infrastructure costs. And consider things like economic diversification, especially for single industry communities such as in the Maritimes. So, it's not just the power of the digital technology, that we need to translate that power into services. And so the way that we're doing that is through what we see with virtual care, virtual well-being, and a number of those things that will really impact us and those remote workers. So that's it for me, Eve. I'm going to hand it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Javi. I'd like to introduce our third speaker, who is Leah Riley, who is Managing Director at Nelson Nygaard. I'll pass the mic over to you.
Great, thank you. Sorry, there we go. Okay, great. I got it to work. Thanks. So it's great to be with you today. And again, Leah Riley, I'm the Managing Director for Nelson Nygaard. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what we should be thinking about in transportation, not just during COVID, but more for the long term. And so before we jump into some of that discussion, I think do a little context setting of what was happening pre-COVID is really important to understand. And so before the pandemic, people were increasingly using delivery services like Amazon to avoid going to the stores. And since March of this year, Amazon has added 400,000 jobs to keep up with the demand for online shopping. And we were already preparing ourselves for restaurant takeout. As the restaurant industry has pivoted, food delivery services are surging, and month over month, the number of people getting their dinner delivered to them is continuing to increase. And in addition to these new conveniences that have become available, many folks now want to be free of their commute. In 2018, Americans spent an average of 28 minutes on a one-way commute, which is more than 200 hours annually. And people are reporting that they're really enjoying having that time back. So it has already been discussed by the previous panelists. It's probably no surprise that commutes are going to be looking very different once the pandemic ends. And in America, recent surveys of workers show that 50% of people can work from home, and that of those 50%, 35 of them expect to continue to spend less time in the office moving forward. So let's turn to the topic at hand and talk about how COVID-19 has impacted our transportation systems and what cities should do to respond, not just for now, but in the long term. And I'd like to look at transit first, which is by far the hardest hit in our industry. And without the Congressional CARES Act, many of our public transit systems would be bankrupt, probably even shuttered by now. But the federal government recognized what cities already knew, that transit is essential during this pandemic, and it's also essential for our economic recovery. As shown on the graph on the right, their changes in demand vary by city, with some transit systems faring better than others, like New York. But as the graph on the left shows, when all cities are taken into account, which includes transit systems across the globe, the change in demand has been a precipitous drop across the board. And just last week, the US DOT reported public transit ridership is down 63% since the start of the pandemic. So who's riding our transit systems now? Our riders are overwhelmingly female, and they tend to be Black or Latino. Among whites, public transit ridership has dropped by half. People on our trains and buses are traveling to healthcare and food jobs. More than 90% of riders are using transit to commute to work. And the jobs they're going to are largely essential workers in low-paying jobs. More than 70% make under $50,000 a year, and these riders don't have other options. Only 9% of the riders have a car, 6% have access to a car, and the remaining 85% rely exclusively on public transit. So given these numbers, it might be surprising to you to learn that across the nation, voters approved 15 of 18 transit-related ballot measures in the November elections, totaling more than $40 billion. And this happened even before the news of a potential vaccine broke. So that means that Americans are really confident about the economic recovery, and they're also sure that transportation is going to have to be a part of that economic recovery. As transit agencies are looking to stay afloat, right now they're reducing service offerings and they're eliminating routes, they're reducing hours. So in order to keep people riding public transit, the first last mile challenge is now important as it has ever been. So transit agencies need to partner with micromobility companies to make getting to and from destinations as easy as possible. And these partnerships need to be really dynamic and have frequent touch points. As routes are changed, services are reduced or eliminated, every effort needs to be made to make sure there's a solution in place other than driving alone in your car. And also when it comes to our transit systems, it's really important to recognize that 25 million Americans have a travel limiting disability. The majority of riders using paratransit services are going to medical appointments, and the next biggest group uses this service for day programs. And as we move out of our health crisis and try to restore normalcy, the number of Americans with mobility challenges will have grown. Therefore, it's important to not only sustain this service during COVID, but also to plan for its long-term viability. City and state officials need to think about how they can flex their dollars to partner with microtransit and community service providers. They can also look to safely loosen permitting restrictions. They can explore fixed route service options and deploy technologies to pair up riders in their trips to have more efficient driver dispatching and routing. And these actions will only help to sustain these services for the long term. So when it comes to transit as a whole, cities need to find new revenue sources to help maintain access to jobs for the most transit-dependent commuters and for a faster return to full operating capacity as transit demand returns. We need to emphasize the real vectors for transmission of the coronavirus, which are indoor social gatherings, and emphasize the importance of transit for essential workers. And cities also need to shift their thinking from vehicle throughput and speed to measuring the number of people moved on a street. Transit has the highest capacity for moving people in a constrained space. And in places where public transit isn't the fastest or most convenient option, transit providers need to work with micromobility providers for first and last mile connections. And lastly, please keep your paratransit systems operating, whether it's through different funding or public-private partnerships. So next, let's turn to the micromobility space and talk about bikes. In the United States, we have seen a tremendous surge in cycling. Beginning in March, bike sales started increasing exponentially, up 121% in that month alone. And sales have continued to boom, largely because people are stuck at home and willing to try something new for exercise, but also because essential workers are adapting to scaled down public transit. In a survey conducted by Trek, 21% of adults plan to ride their bike more during the pandemic, and 50% say they will continue to ride in the post-COVID world. In other areas of the micromobility space, like scooters and TNCs, there have been other significant changes, but the long-term impacts to the industry aren't wholly clear. Our research indicates that there will be a consolidation of private operators into potentially more diversified companies, or companies with much larger market shares. For example, Uber purchased Postmates and Lime acquired Jump. And we also believe there's going to be growth in personally owned e-bikes and scooters due to the boom in demand for individual travel. And we also believe TNCs are going to experience lasting damage to the pooled ride-hailing model and growth for them with TNC transit partnerships. Our parking industry has also been very hard hit across the country. This data from Sparking, which is a company that tracks parking transactions, shows that parking took its biggest hit at the beginning of the pandemic. And as cities eased restrictions and opened up their businesses, parking began to come back, although well below prior year levels. And you can see it is beginning to drop off once again now that new restrictions are being implemented. The pandemic is becoming more dire. So this is especially problematic for cities that are dependent on parking revenue to sustain their transportation programs. Some creative solutions that are being deployed across the US during the pandemic that are also very smart policy solutions for the long term are to change parking rates to progressive tiered rates, extending time limits, implementing contactless payment systems, and charging loading zone and stand fees. Another pivot that cities are making is to issue permits for outdoor dining. For decades, the majority of curb space has been dedicated to free or low-cost car storage, which has been underscored by the pandemic. So cities across the country are recognizing a way to help businesses survive and to recoup some of their lost parking meter revenue is to issue permits for outdoor dining. And in addition to allowing businesses to use curb space, cities need to recognize the value of their curbs for the long term. Even though we have the post-COVID horizon seems to be within reach, leading into a flexible curb management system now will allow cities to respond to changes in demands, commute schedules of different modes, not just for now, but for the long term. To flex your curb, you need to start with a full digitized inventory, followed by performance monitoring to better serve evolving needs. And cities need to focus on both accommodating curb-based mobility services like scooters and lift cars and keep them from overtaking the curb at the expense of walking, cycling, transit, parking, and loading. A hopefully long-lasting impact of the pandemic is the recognition that our streets can create community and not just be space occupied by parked and moving cars. As people continue to work from home, ensuring SOV trips don't increase to get your groceries or go to the park, or that your neighborhood streets are overrun with delivery drivers, cities need to build up infrastructure that support walking and biking. Cities like Portland, Oregon have turned almost 90 miles of roads into neighborhood greenways where walkers and bikers are given preference through infrastructure and reduced speed limits. And as I briefly mentioned previously, contactless payment systems are increasingly important. Whether it's for parking, transit, a taxi, or bike share, the demand for contactless payment has only been exacerbated by the pandemic, and it's reasonable to expect that in the future, people are going to want to continue to safeguard their health by touching fewer things to prevent the spread of germs. Contactless payment systems are critical to making public transportation of any form safer, and in the long run will improve speed, convenience, and reduce costs. They eliminate the hassle of waiting in line, the cost of printing tickets, and maintaining fare equipment. And just to briefly touch upon air quality, when the lockdown started, traffic plummeted and it had a positive impact on air quality. For the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, March 2020 had the lowest monthly atmospheric NO2 levels of any March since at least 2005. Measures of particulate matter in the air dropped more than 40% in the US after lockdown measures were put in place. And recent research has shown that the drop in traffic has prevented thousands of premature deaths. So in order to continue to reap these benefits for our personal and climate health, City officials need to get serious about implementing measures to reduce traffic for the long term. This is especially important because as lockdowns loosen, city leaders are scrambling to address a new problem, which is the prospect of gridlock worse than before the pandemic. In many cities, officials are worrying that people will avoid public transit for fear of catching the virus and decide to drive instead, which is going to push vehicle traffic higher than ever. And there are already warning signs. More than 30 large cities coming out of lockdown, including Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Oslo, and Geneva, recorded more congestion on their roads in mid-June compared with the same period last year. So to get ahead of what could be halting gridlock, cities need to get serious about congestion pricing now. Congestion pricing can improve the lives of most people who own a car, and for all of those that don't, it can maintain free-flowing traffic on freeways even during peak hours. London, Singapore, Stockholm, and other cities charge tolls for drivers on important roads at peak hours to manage traffic, and many more cities, including New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and Portland, are poised to follow these leaders. And life is going to be much better after we get used to and learn to appreciate freeways that are free-flowing because they're not free for low-occupancy vehicles. So to bring it all together, in summary, my recommendations to cities are to work to gain local and state funding for transit. This is a long game. Advocate for transit across the board and give buses priority on your roads. And make sure all those new bikes are able to safely share the road, including e-bikes. Track micromobility data at the most granular level possible and focus your micromobility regulations on outcomes, not the provider itself. Implement a flexible curb program, move to contactless payment systems, amplify the positive environmental impacts from COVID and commit to them, and get really serious about implementing congestion pricing. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. So I think we're now going to be switching to the Q&A session, and I'll wait for that slide to pop up. So for folks who haven't gone onto Slido, please go to www.slido.com and enter the code remote work. There's a number of great questions already seated in there, and then you'll have an opportunity to vote on those. So thank you to all of the speakers. Thanks for joining me again on screen. That was a really great session, lots of interesting and diverse perspectives, which I'm sure we'll delve more into as we get through some of these questions. So I have a question of my own, but let me start with some of the ones that are already up on Slido. This first question, I think, is directed at Pat. So you had a big list of all these events, historic events where telecommuting saw a great uptake. So I sense a bit of skepticism maybe in this question. Are the listed events localized events, or at most events that were in a few regions? Is there any disruptive event along these lines that was, sorry, I need to move my screen there, that was truly global? So Pat, maybe I could direct that question to you to answer.
Great. Yes, absolutely. Great question. And you're right that obviously the extreme events in question are most often going to be localized. The one that comes closest would be the SARS pandemic. That was 2003, I believe it was. So certainly global region wide, if you will, and a great deal of fear about going to work and mixing with others in the work environment. So if behind the question is the doubt that, so this is different, I would agree in that sense that we are seeing this on a much, first of all, wider spread geographically and more prolonged temporally than any of those other events on the list. What I will say, though, is that at bottom, it comes down to individual choices, or at least probably does in most cases, both employer and employee. So, of course, during the pandemic, teleworking has been to a great extent involuntary, although not exclusively so. But when there is a choice, then the question will be, what will individuals do? And they may or may not be heavily swayed by what's going on globally, is my point.
Thanks, Pat. Now, you had a chart in your presentation where you gave your prediction of where you think things will land in the pre-COVID and current situation. I think it seems fair to ask the other speakers, to weigh in on their thoughts on Pat's prediction and on your own. So Javi, maybe I'll go with you because I think your presentation showed maybe a bit more optimism of a longer term stay for remote working.
Yeah, I think it'll be substantively more people that will work at home remotely, but it might not be 100% of the time. You may choose to go into the office a couple of days a week. At TELUS, we actually have 3 types of workers. So you're either an office employee, you're an at-home, or you're a mobile. And the majority of the roles are actually mobile, which kind of leads to the next one that's talking about coffee shops and that sort of thing. So your office may be your client's office, or it may be a coffee shop or a library or whatever else you choose. So I think that the concept of remote work is changing. And that's certainly what we've learned over 10 years of having mobile employees.
Great, thanks. And Leah, what are your thoughts on whether or not remote work at the level we're seeing today is likely to stay or revert back to pre-pandemic times?
I don't think it's going to revert back to pre-pandemic times. I mean, I showed in my slide that I think what people are really interested in is having the option to do both. People are really enjoying to not have to commute every day. There's the convenience of being able to be at home and get work done. So I think it's going to be a blend. I think people miss seeing their coworkers. They want to have some of that time and back to have the synergy of, meeting and being with your colleagues, but also blended with the idea that you can get more done at home and take care of more things in your personal life more easily when you're free of the commute and going into the office. So I think just like Javi and Pat said, that we're going to see probably people doing both, maybe 2 to 3 days a week in the office or 2 to 3 days at home. But that is a tremendous increase from pre-COVID levels of working from home.
Great, thanks everyone for your comments. So let's move on to the next question here. So what role will third places, coffee shops, libraries, parks, play in a potential future, and how would transportation and land use planning be affected? Maybe we could start with Javi for this one, since you've already kind of touched on these third places in your previous response.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the third places are already pretty significant. I think the challenge will be, will they have access to Wi-Fi? A lot of places, if you went to a Starbucks, for example, you'd have Wi-Fi. Or what you find now is a lot of coffee shops will put, you have to buy something from them, and you have a limited amount of time that you can stay there. So the limitation won't be because of the technology necessarily, or the coffee shop itself. It'll be because the business needs to be able to be sustainable. But people need a bit of a change of pace, and going into the office was that change of pace. So if maybe you're not going into the office location, the coffee shop or meeting people at other areas is a great option.
Thanks for that. And so, Leah, what do you think? Do you think these third places will play more of a role? And what do you think the transportation and land use impacts might be if they have a greater role?
Yeah, I think so. There's this trend that we're seeing that's been going faster now that COVID is taking place, about 15-minute neighborhoods, because so many people are working from home. The idea and the need that you can get everything you need within a 15 or 20-minute walk of your home is becoming more pronounced. So cities are starting to plan for what we in Portland call 15-minute neighborhoods. And part of that is going to be the need to be able to get somewhere outside your house if you're not going to go to work. I think everybody, even pre-COVID, loved to go into the coffee shop a couple of days a week or sometime just to have a different pace, different change of scene. So I think that's going to continue, but I think land use planning is going to have to become very different to allow for greater density in neighborhoods and not just in the downtown core, to allow for people to live, work, and play within their neighborhoods. So I alluded to it a little bit on my slide, calling blurred neighborhoods. So I think that's going to change a lot moving forward. And especially as people have moved, somebody on this panel alluded to it in their presentation, is that people are moving further and further away from downtown areas. And so that is going to push the need to support those residences further away from the downtown core as well.
So, Pat, it sounds like these sort of third places or hubs or remote work sites have been talked about for a while. What are your thoughts? Do you think that again they'll play their role, but maybe not any more than they already play?
Well, they certainly will continue to play at least the role they've already played. I think they're part of the mix, right? It's not going to be that suddenly everyone who works from home will be flocking to them. I think we're very heterogeneous. I'm perfectly content if I'm going to work from home at all, which I'm not all that excited about doing on an ongoing basis. But when I do work from home, I work from home. For me, it's very disruptive to pick up and go somewhere else where there might be distractions and blah, blah, blah. And as another point on that, I was attending a workshop a couple of weeks ago in which it was about housing. And so they were talking about residential relocation, but also residential renovations going on during the pandemic. And at the very top of the list, right after bathrooms, which are perennially at the top of the list, were outdoor spaces, patios, porches, decks. And so, people who already maybe have a modest yard or any outdoor space are trying to configure it to make it more conducive to hanging out there more. If you're buying the bigger house, then you're going to be paying attention to what it's like in the backyard. So again, I think it's just going to be a mix. I think we'll see more of it. And I fully agree with the desirability of a 15-minute neighborhood. Even though I am a homebody, there are plenty of places I could walk to within 15 minutes if I wanted to, including a Starbucks. So it's nice to have the option. Not everyone will exercise it or exercise it very often. But those kinds of amenities provide a great deal of quality of life, regardless of how often people use them while working.
The 15-minute neighborhood is certainly something that will feature in our Transport 2050 plan. And I think that's definitely this trend that we're seeing across different parts of North America, I think is something that, we anticipate to grow. I'm actually going to jump to the second question on here. So, in talking about people moving out of urban cores, is that just a prediction? I know for myself personally, we're in the middle of buying a house to get a little bit more space. And certainly it's a hot market for, suburban areas with a little bit more space. What are your thoughts? Do you think people are moving out of the urban core to regional areas? And what could that mean for transportation? Especially if, for regions like ours, where the closer you get to downtown, the higher the cost of real estate, as I'm sure is the case in most cities. If people are moving out, how far are they moving if they don't need to do that commute anymore? And what does that mean for how people need to get around? What does that mean for transit to service, the 2 days a week when they do want to go into the office? Maybe I'll start with Leah on that one.
Sure. Yeah. So in America, we're seeing lots of people moving out of the cities into suburban regions. I mean, the pandemic really made the desire to have a big house with office space for you, your spouse, your kids, really important, and also to have outdoor space so you weren't stuck inside a lot. So a lot of people are moving out of the city center. What I'm most concerned about is when we start returning to work, if people are continuing to live further out, what it's going to mean for our transportation systems in terms of traffic. We simply don't have transit networks that feed all of our outlying suburban areas. They're really designed to serve dense neighborhood areas. And so I think that we're going to see an uptick in VMT, if people coming back in to go to work, which is why I think it's so important for cities right now to start thinking about congestion pricing as a way to mitigate some of those impacts, but also for transit agencies to start thinking pretty seriously about microtransit as well as bus service, because it's much cheaper to implement than rail to serve. But I think it's to be seen how long people are going to want to continue to live in outlying areas. And for many people, they have had the privilege and the ability to buy a second home and not just leave their first home. So they've bought their second vacation home. So it's yet to be seen how many people are really going to stay in outlying areas.
Thanks, Leah. Pat, what are your thoughts on this movement to the burbs?
It's a complex question, or a complex answer, and I agree with Leah. We see a lot of it happening now. I'm too wondering, we may be seeing like a year or two's worth of acceleration of plans that people might have had anyway, and or a bit of slowdown after we realize that, okay, we're not going to have to telework as much anymore. And again, the 1.5 days a week, obviously, again, is not universal for everyone, but it is a fairly robust average. And at that frequency of teleworking, it doesn't make sense to move 200 or 300 miles away or 100 miles away. However, I will say that the longer distance teleworking is an area that has hardly been studied to my knowledge at all with respect to transportation and even greenhouse gas emission implications. So anecdotally, we all know, maybe some of us are, people who live in one state or province and headquarters is in another one, hundreds of miles away. And we may go, whether driving or flying, once a month, once a quarter, or a couple times a year. And believe me, you can, of course, account for way more greenhouse gases with 1 or 2 flights than you do with local commuting 200 days a year. So it remains to be seen how much of that even exists now, let alone is it accelerating? Will it be increased in the wake of this? Another question farther down on the list was about salary implications of working from anywhere and so forth. So another complicated issue that affects residential location choices as well. So bottom line, as with everything, it's not going to be all one or the other. Long ago, a city planner named William White said, you can't repeal the geometry of the center. And so central cities are always going to be attractive because they're central. And so I don't see, a long-term vacation of the city center. I see perhaps a different mix of people moving in. Again, a lot of dynamic flux over time.
Thanks, Pat. And Javi, you had some discussion of this in your slides as well, in the cities needing to prepare for a bit more of this movement. What are your comments on this and thoughts on this?
I don't think it's an easy answer, and it's complex. The Globe and Mail has actually had a few articles on this in the last couple of months. I don't think that our cities are dead and that everybody's going to move out into the rural areas. I think that as we see things open back up, like sports events and theaters and that sort of thing, that attracts people to the core outside of work, it'll be important for communities and those urban cities to rethink the types of services and facilities that they offer. There's certain, I think that Vancouver is actually quite good in terms of the urban planning and making sure it's not dead in the middle of as soon as 5 o'clock happens and everybody leaves from work. There's more available in terms of services than just offices and the restaurants and that sort of thing. So I think we do see people moving more further out because they want the bigger square footage and that kind of thing. But I think there's still a mix of those people that want that urbanality to it.
Great, thanks. So one of the challenges is that with reduced demand on, say, transit systems, as a result of remote work, would that kind of be a reason for reduced funding availability to ensure that those systems are, still available for? And I think, Leah, your presentation really highlighted large segments of the population, or half, can't telework and do rely on our transit system. So maybe I'll direct this one to you first. Do you worry that funding will be reduced as a result of reduced demand will impact the ability to build large capital projects for transit?
Here in the United States, I don't. I mean, I think all of the local and state ballot measures that were successful in the November election are a good indicator about how people feel about transit and transportation investments in the country. And we also have really great hope with President-elect Biden. He has come out saying he is all in for transit and sees it as an equitable investment in terms of transportation resources in our country. So here, I don't think so. And also, it's important to remember that these large capital projects, not only do they have great outcomes for our transportation systems, they also equate to jobs. And jobs are so important right now. And they will be for many years to come after COVID. Research on economic recovery from the Depression in 2008, 2009 showed that it took a minimum of 3 years for most industries to get back to some normal footing, and many of them took up to 10 years. So I think these types of jobs are going to be important for the long haul.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to reply to that? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question. Just a quick note that this session runs till 11:15, so we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more. Okay, I'm going to jump to the one that's asking about onboarding new employees. So existing employees going remote is one thing. I think one of the concerns that we've discussed internally is, what does it mean for the social? We've got social capital that we've built up, having been face-to-face for a long time. How do we onboard new employees where you don't have that opportunity for face-to-face? So what trends are you seeing on employers' willingness to onboard new employees 100% remotely? Maybe Pat, did you want to take a stab at this one based on your past experiences and past trends, or what your trends are seeing today?
Well, probably Javi is the best person to address this, but I can say that it can be difficult. And I've seen some statistics that surprised me indicating that millennial age workers were less attracted to teleworking than older workers. And, partly that may be the kinds of jobs they're currently holding, but I think it's also their early stage in career that in many cases they realize the need for on face-to-face mentoring with older workers. So I do feel like those who are just trying to get a foothold on the career ladder may find teleworking less appealing. And of course, it's surprising because us older people, assumed that once the digital natives, got old enough to be moving to management, then teleworking would take over because they all knew how to do it and it was fine and so forth. So it's a bit counterintuitive if they're more resistant to it, but it makes sense if you think about their needs for again, tacit knowledge transmission, socialization of the workplace, and just mentorship of older, more experienced workers. So, but I'll be eager to see what Javi's experience is.
Javi, over to you.
Thank you. I think the important part of this is the cultural transformation aspect as a barrier, right? From an employer perspective, you have a bunch of processes that you have in place. From an HR perspective, it is very different to have 100% remotely on board. So you have to have the processes. You also have to have a leadership team that supports that and is able to provide that support. So what Pat was talking about, some of the millennial and the younger folks, I think they need a different type of social interaction. How, as leaders of that company, are you able to manage that? And it's a bit of a process that you need to go through, and each different employer will find that they're at different stages along the way.
Leah, did you want to weigh in on that from a consulting perspective? Nelson Nygaard having offices around the world, if not North America, not the world.
Well, I wholly agree with what both Javi and Pat have said. We are being forced right now to do onboarding 100% remotely, and it is challenging. It can be done, but there's just nothing like being able to see a new employee in person, introduce them to the office, introduce them to the space, and have that in-person touch. It makes such a difference for somebody, especially a new employee and somebody who's just starting in their career. I think it's easier for people who've been around for a while to get onboarded remotely, but for our younger workers, it has just been, it's really challenging, and they need a lot of help. And so onboarding isn't just day one. Onboarding is your mentoring and coaching for like 3, 6, 9, even a year-long process. If you learn the company, you learn your job, and it has been very challenging.
So I like to ask one of my own questions now. So what are your thoughts in terms of remote work and its potential to support increased affordability? Again, this is a really expensive region to live in: housing, transportation, and pretty much everything. What does remote work play a role in supporting increased affordability? Just curious your thoughts on that. Maybe Pat?
Well, you can save a lot of money by teleworking, depending on what your habits were when you're commuting regularly. So a lot of people go out to lunch every day. You don't have, so you can save a lot of money on lunches, or maybe after work, stop by the bar or whatever. Dry cleaning, maybe even grooming, certainly transportation costs and so forth. Now, on the other side, are you the one paying the utility bill for winter heating and summer air? Are you paying for the lights? Are you running the dishwasher more, etc.? So some of those issues I don't think have been fully universally resolved, shall we say. In the early days of telecommuting, there were telecommuting agreements, and those kinds of things were hashed out, who was going to pay for what. But there certainly are a lot of opportunities to reduce costs, and anecdotally, we're seeing people, cheered by how much they can save while working from home. So I do think, on the whole, it can probably be a net savings for workers.
Eva, if I could just real quick on that, I think 100% what Pat said. We're also seeing no trends here in America of workers saying that if you want to continue to work from home, you're going to take a percentage decrease in your salary. And I think this is in large part because they've already had to pay for their commercial space. Their rents aren't going down, their lease costs aren't going down, and they're paying for the space of this employee, whether they choose to show up and use it or not. And so there's many instances of companies actually taking away pay for people who are continuing to work from home. So that never can make up for your utility bills, your transportation costs, and things like that. So I think that's a very disturbing trend of employers passing on this cost to their employees.
Thanks for that. Super interesting. Javi, did you want to weigh in on this question?
Well, I think TELUS certainly doesn't take money away, but we have got research that shows, and one of the slides that shows the savings for employees just in the commuting costs since 2006 has been, $240 million. So there is substantive savings that they can make. It really depends on how many days a week that they're coming back into the office.
There's also the issue, if I can jump in, of what somebody referred to as wage arbitrage. There's some discussion that if workers can be anywhere, then we can hire workers from anywhere. So why do we need to pay the higher cost of living in Vancouver if we can hire somebody in Saskatchewan or something? I'm a little dubious as to how widespread that's going to be, given the other issues that we've been discussing, the desirability of face-to-face to some extent, on a episodic basis at least. But at the margin, there could be some job losses from urban areas to the heartland, so to speak, and companies save money by paying lower salaries. Again, potentially a disturbing trend unless you live in the heartland.
Thank you so much to everyone for all your great questions, everyone from the audience, and to our panelists for the great discussion. So we're going to be wrapping up. As I noted at the beginning, there'll be a recording and that will be uploaded in a few days. I believe a survey is also going out to attendees. We'd love to hear from you on how you thought this went. I think there's also an opportunity to hear from you in terms of your ideas for making remote work. just another note that Transport 2050 will be going out for more broader public engagement and continuing this conversation in 2021. So thank you once again, everyone, for attending. Thanks again for the panelists for all your great thoughts and great discussion, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.